everybody. Welcome to Online Painting. It's nice to have a little introduction music, isn't it? I think so. But I'll put the ukulele away and we'll talk about paint. I wanted to take a minute to show up on your screen just to say hello and art matters, and tell you that I wish you all the best, and I hope you're doing well in our new era. For now, we're going to go through a series of slides, and we're going to look at many different ways that people create the human figure in paint, or the face. We're also going to take a little side trip, and we'll look at animals, because they can be a fun way to get used to painting living beings, and then you can move into a person after that. But before we do anything else, I think I can just go away so we can just focus on the art. All right? Hope you're doing well. Thinking of you all right now. All right, so to begin with, this picture, in this painting, I guess this woman is Christine Caron. All right, she's a great painter. She's worked with both traditional flesh tones, but she's also brought a lot of wild colors into it. And notice how she's used the reds on the shadow side and more really cool colors on the light side. Also, I think one of the things that really makes this particular painting work is her inclusion of this light area up here. So let's move on. In painting, we can go for extreme realism. As we see here, this looks to be one by the artist Chuck Close, but I'm not certain of that. In this case, it's very much like a charcoal drawing, only it's done with paint. And here is an artist who's working on one of those. And we can see that we're going to talk about flesh tones in the upcoming tutorial. And really, mixing flesh tones anywhere from the lightest tones to the darkest tones is really a pretty simple process once you get the hang of it. Here's another example of realism. And what I want you to notice here is a couple of things. First off, there is a bit of extreme foreshortening happening here, and that's an assignment that they've been doing in the drawing class, and I think I'll go ahead and include that with the painting class because some of you might enjoy that. The other thing that I want you to notice is the way this artist has done the shadows here with this warm color right at the edge of the shadow and a sort of almost a green tint in the shadows. Now let's go from this to something completely different. So here the form is really rather abstracted, and we can return to the theme of simplified values. Now, another thing that I like to notice, well, before I talk about anything else, let's say what I mean by the simplified values. You see how all of the way the shadows and light hit the object are really broken down into abstractions, and it creates a very interesting image of the figure in profile. Another thing, which is sort of like the one of my songs I repeat endlessly, is what we'll call color harmony. Okay, so in one way of looking at it, this is all reds and yellows and oranges, which we don't really see here, but we do because of the red lips and the blue eyes and the red of the earring. That ties in and makes it rather dramatic. Now let's look at another one that's a little different. This one really shows a pretty high level of skill, but it's also probably got a lot of collage ingredients in there. So this is an example of an artist who's started with an acrylic painting and then used pretty much anything that he or she can find to create an interesting work of art. Everything that we see here is a possibility for you to be inspired by. Although I don't want you to copy any of the images in the slideshow unless you're going to copy it and then make an additional one that is purely your own. Here again, we have an artist who's making really interesting use of colors. So we do have traditional skin tones, but then they've also brought into it blues and greens and then purples as it goes back into the shadow. So often in art, we'll talk about warm and cool. And what do we mean by that? Well, warm colors, reds, oranges, yellows, they tend to come towards the viewer, while cool colors, the blues and the greens, they tend to recede. And we can see this happening here, although there are many cool colors in the foreground. The ones that are most coming towards us are the flesh tones. And this is really an interesting use of a juxtaposition of warm and cool. Now, if warm and cool confuses you, then all you have to do is just keep it simple. And remember that purple is actually seen as the most neutral, neither warm nor cool. So check out how this is a centered composition, but not exactly a centered composition. Let's move on. So this one, on the other hand, is exactly centered, as if it were an icon. And here is a kind of a stylized mask. And I wanted to include it to get you all thinking. So as I said, you're welcome to copy this to learn. You can copy these images to learn, but if you do, you also have to do an original painting based on what you learned. Or you could also be inspired by what you see here and create your own original work. Let's keep going. So here we have a traditional portrait. I like it because it's painted with beautiful loose strokes. And look at how this artist has painted the hair. The hair is generally not painted as a lot of up and down lines, but rather squint your eyes and notice the texture that you see here. Also notice how this artist has really done a wonderful job of rendering the shadows. Here we have sort of warmer light in the light part and cools in the shadows. Here's one that's quite a bit more abstract. So either of these are fine. Now this is more of what we would call an expressionistic painting, because really it's about the look in the woman's eyes. And this artist has gone so far as to make those eyes quite a bit bigger in order to convey a feeling. Notice the texture on the scarf. So as we decide, as we determine and we do our best to get accurate drapery, there's also the option of just making patterns, which can be really fun. Here's another one. Again, we have simplified values. It's not exactly realistic. It has kind of an angular edge to it, and this makes it all the more powerful as a portrait. So we're going to look at a few more of these. This one is lovely. I believe it's painted with a palette knife. It would take a lot of skill to do this with the palette knife. My guess would be that the eyes and some other aspects were painted with a brush, and then the artist did most of it with a palette knife. So if you find yourself wanting to try that technique in a portrait, go ahead and let yourself use the brush where you need to, and then you can come back in with the palette knife. Here's something totally different. Well, she's completely abstract, but she's also got a really interesting feel. Now here, notice how the eyes are even a little crooked. A lot about it is crooked, but it's still captured a feeling. Here's one in process, but I believe it's also a finished painting. What I love about this is that there's two things happening here. There's these squares, these dabs of paint, and then there's also a complete emotion expressed in the sitter. Now let's look at what we'll call figurative paintings. All right, this one is very traditional, lots of light. It brings to mind the artist Renoir, who painted during the Impressionist era. He could also, his name is spelled like Renoir, R-E-N-O-I-R. You might want to look him up if you like this kind of light in painting. One of the things that we see here is that even the shadows generally are not that dark. One thing I really like about this one is the way that the artist has rendered the lily pads kind of abstractly. Now, this one is pure realism, but it could also be called maybe a narrative painting because it's kind of odd. It's also a powerful work. One thing to see here is notice the importance of the shadow on the wall, okay? So you might not even see that at first glance, but if it wasn't there, it would be a completely different painting. Now maybe realism isn't really your thing. Well, here you go. Here's one. And this is a very simple painting, and yet it's so full of emotion, very powerful. This might inspire you, and it looks also to be done with a palette knife. Here's one that sort of shows our process, the demonstration process that I will cover in how to paint a portrait. Also, this artist has made great use of dripping. Here's another along the lines of who needs for it to be photographically real. And then let's look at a few more. I find this one to be really beautiful. I would say it's somewhere between realism and abstraction. Notice the shadows here. They're painted on her clothing, painted in purples. And on the face, they have a little, it's like green into the browns. Here's one more. She's a portrait. Somehow she's slipped in. Two more. There you go. Figurative. Now this one again, this is just fun. What you could notice here is how the turquoise and the yellow are playing off each other, but they're not really mixing. And that is part of the effect. All right, here's one last one. This one is not necessarily realistic, but very, very expressionistic. And that might be useful also. Okay, now let's go to pets. Okay, here we have Rover, very realistic. Now here the artist has done some pretty simple things, blue collar, blue background. The tongue is rendered. If you do want to render a tongue like that, you just have to look at the shape of it and pretend it's the basic shapes and just paint what you see. One thing to look at here, which is true in all of the paintings of either humans or animals, and that is the relationships. I'm going to go over that yet again. Look, the eye somehow leads right up to the ear, and the ear leads right into the jaw, and the jaw leads back up to the eye, which leads down here, which leads down here. It is those relationships which are most important and which I want you to look for when you're painting either a figure or a portrait or an animal, really anything else. But that's a great way to get a likeness, is to look for those connections. So we'll go quickly through a few more. Oh, wow, that's pretty awesome. That's what made this work, was that the artist started with a pretty strong likeness and then just got a little wild with the color. Okay, here's another example, the horse, partially abstract and partially realistic. Here's one that's very realistic, and you know what, we are coming into Easter. You're welcome to paint a bunny, but try not to make it be so cute, just pretty cute. Okay, now this next one would probably fall into the title of surrealism. In some weird way, this is maybe my favorite because it's just so odd. It's like a person dog. It looks like there could be a little bit of a joke involved here. But if you want to break it down to what they've done, there's human eyes, nose, and mouth on a dog, along with some kind of a leg thing. And so it ends up just looking rather creepy, but interesting. Here's Fido, simplified. And everybody likes Bessie. There she is. We've just got a couple of more. Here's one more realistic. Okay, now that one looks like it was based on a photograph. You're welcome to do that. You know, what makes this particular painting work, I would say, is the rim lighting. The way that it's got the highlights all around the edge. Now that can be a wonderful one to play with. And here's one more. Okay, here we have the turtle. There you go. And I just realized I left the silhouettes out. So to finish, here we go. Here's Fido. All right, so I will do yet another slideshow that will show you a series of silhouette paintings, if that's what you want to do. But mostly with this, I want you to have a good time, to learn about art, and to understand these relationships. Even in this one, they still have the connections. All right, speaking of connections, I hope you're all feeling connected and enjoying the day. Thanks for listening.